Karen Prescott pressed her manicured finger against her living room window, so hard it left a smudge, watching in absolute horror as her neighbor's pool pump churned out thousands of gallons of crystal-clear water into the street. The audacity! She yanked her phone from her designer purse with the fury of a woman who just discovered her favorite parking spot had been stolen. 911. Yes, I need to report a theft in progress, she barked into the phone, pacing her marble foyer like a caged tiger. My neighbor is stealing our community's water resources. The dispatcher's confused voice crackled through. Ma'am, are you saying someone is taking water from your property? He's draining his entire pool. Do you have any idea how much water that is? This is environmental terrorism. Karen's voice pitched higher with each word, her perfectly styled blonde bob trembling with indignation. 20 minutes later, two bewildered police officers stood in Karen's driveway as she gestured wildly toward the Hendersons' house. Officer Martinez scratched his head while Officer Chen tried to hide a smirk. Mrs. Prescott, Officer Martinez said slowly, people are allowed to drain their own pools. But the HOA regulations clearly state. Karen whipped out a 3-ring binder thick enough to stop a bullet, frantically flipping through laminated pages. Here, Section 47B. All water usage must be environmentally conscious and community-minded. Officer Chen peered at the binder. Ma'am, this appears to be a grocery list from 2019. Karen's face flushed crimson as she snatched the binder back. Well, the principle remains. As HOA president, I have a duty to protect this community from reckless water waste. The officers exchanged glances. We'll make a note of your concerns, Officer Martinez said diplomatically before they retreated to their patrol car, leaving Karen standing alone in her driveway, clutching her binder like a shield. But Karen Prescott hadn't become the most feared HOA president in Willowbrook Estates by backing down from a fight. As the police car disappeared around the corner, she marched across the street with the determination of a general heading into battle. If the law wouldn't help her, she'd handle this herself. The Hendersons' front door opened before she could even ring the bell. Mike Henderson, a soft-spoken accountant in his 40s, stood there in swim trunks and a confused expression. Hi, Karen. Everything okay? Everything is most certainly not okay, Michael, she snapped, using his full name like a weapon. Your little pool party is destroying our property values and violating at least 6 HOA regulations. Mike blinked. I'm just draining the pool for winter maintenance. Same thing I do every year. Not this year, you're not. Karen spent the next 3 hours hunched over her laptop, furiously typing new HOA regulations with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for the Supreme Court. Her husband, Gerald, tiptoed around the kitchen, occasionally glancing at his wife's hunched form with the wariness of someone who'd lived through 23 years of Karen's crusades. Honey, Gerald ventured, setting down a cup of chamomile tea next to her elbow. Maybe you should. Section 73A. Karen announced triumphantly, spinning her laptop around. Emergency Water Conservation Protocol. No homeowner may drain more than 500 gallons of water per day without written consent from the HOA board. Gerald squinted at the screen. But Karen, you are the HOA board. It's just you since everyone else resigned last month. Karen waved dismissively. Details. The important thing is that I'm implementing this effective immediately. She grabbed her phone and began dialing. Mrs. Chen. This is Karen Prescott with an emergency HOA notification. By sunset. Karen had called every resident in Willowbrook Estates, sent 17 emails, and posted no fewer than 4 different notices on the community bulletin board. The Hendersons' pool was still draining. Standing in her front yard with her hands on her hips, Karen watched the steady stream of water flowing down the storm drain like it was personally insulting her. This called for desperate measures. At 6 a.m. sharp, Karen positioned herself on the sidewalk in front of the Hendersons' house with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and a clipboard. She'd fashioned a bright orange sash reading, Hell a in for see me in say, from an old Halloween costume, and wore it with the pride of a beauty queen. Mike Henderson emerged from his garage in work clothes, stopping dead when he saw Karen's sidewalk command post. "Karen, what are you doing?" "Monitoring compliance with emergency water conservation protocols," she replied crisply, making a notation on her clipboard. "Pool drainage continues in violation of Section 73A. You made that rule up yesterday." By Thursday morning, Karen had filed complaints with 7 different city departments, contacted the local news station twice, and started a petition on 3 separate online platforms. Her dining room table resembled a war room, covered with printed regulations, highlighted ordinances, and photos of the water waste incident taken from various angles. The first sign that her campaign might have gone too far came when Officer Martinez returned, this time with a different expression entirely. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, standing on her front porch with his arms crossed, "we need to talk about harassment." Karen's perfectly applied lipstick formed a thin line. "I haven't harassed anyone. I simply exercised my rights as a concerned citizen. Calling 911 14 times about the same pool isn't exercising rights. It's abusing emergency services." He pulled out a small notepad. "Then there's the complaint about suspicious water activities you filed with code enforcement, the environmental terrorism report with the EPA, and let's not forget the anonymous tip about illegal dumping you called in to the water department." "I never said it was anonymous," Karen protested weakly. "Ma'am, you gave them your name, address, and HOA title every time." But the real shock came when Mike Henderson appeared behind Officer Martinez, looking tired but determined. "Karen," Mike said quietly, "I need you to stop. I'm protecting our community values. You're destroying them." Mike's voice was steady but firm. "Mrs. Chen is afraid to water her garden because you might report her. The Johnsons are considering moving because you've made living here miserable. And yesterday, you tried to convince my 8-year-old daughter that I was breaking the law." Karen felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I simply explained the environmental implications to a child, Karen, at her school bus stop." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Mrs. Prescott, I'm issuing you a formal warning about harassment. Any more reports about pool drainage, and we'll have to consider other options." After they left, Karen stood in her hallway, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror Gerald's mother had given them. For the first time in days, she really looked at herself, hair slightly disheveled, lipstick smudged, eyes wild with the fervor of her crusade. What had she become? Gerald found her there an hour later, still staring at her reflection. "The Hendersons' pool is empty," he said gently. "Mike's starting to refill it for winter covering." Karen nodded slowly. The war was over, and she wasn't sure who had won. That evening, she drafted a letter of resignation from the HOA board, then deleted it, then rewrote it, then deleted it again. Outside her window, the Hendersons' house glowed warmly in the twilight, their empty pool covered with a dark top like a closed chapter. Karen closed her laptop and walked outside to check her mailbox, something she'd been too busy crusading to do for days. Inside, she found 3 HOA violation notices from neighboring communities, a cease and desist letter from a law firm she'd never heard of, and, most surprisingly, a handwritten note from Mrs. Chen. "Dear Karen," it read in shaky handwriting, "thank you for caring so much about our neighborhood. Sometimes caring can go too far, but the caring itself isn't wrong. Maybe we could find a better way? Sincerely, Helen Chen. P.S. Would you like to have tea tomorrow?" Standing in her driveway with Mrs. Chen's note in her hands, Karen felt something shift inside her chest. The pool was empty, the crisis was over, but somehow this felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. She looked across the street when Mike Henderson was taking out his trash, then at the Chen house where a warm light glowed in the kitchen window. For the first time in weeks, Karen wondered what might happen if she knocked on their door, not with a clipboard or a complaint, but just as a neighbor. But as she turned to go inside, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The Hendersons had installed a new sprinkler system, and it was running at 11 p.m. Karen's hand tightened around Mrs. Chen's letter. Some battles ended, but others were just beginning. Rules are rules, Michael. Perhaps if you'd attended more HOA meetings, you'd understand the democratic process. She made another note. That's insubordination, by the way. Section 12C. Mike's wife, Sarah, appeared beside him, coffee mug in hand. Karen, you're sitting on a public sidewalk at 6 in the morning. Don't you have a job? My job, Karen announced, standing up with theatrical flair, is protecting this community from chaos and lawlessness. Someone has to maintain standards around here. But as Sarah Henderson smiled sweetly and said, well, in that case, you should know that public sidewalks fall under city jurisdiction, not HOA authority. Karen felt the first crack in her armor of righteousness. She spent the rest of the morning researching municipal codes, growing increasingly frustrated as she realized her position was more precarious than she thought. But Karen Prescott didn't become the terror of Willowbrook Estates by admitting defeat. If she couldn't stop the drainage through official channels, she'd get creative. That afternoon, she marched to City Hall with a formal complaint about environmental hazards and property damage from excessive water runoff. Karen's meeting with Councilman Rodriguez did not go as planned. Instead of the sympathetic ear she'd expected, she found herself facing a tired-looking man who seemed more interested in his sandwich than her environmental concerns. Mrs. Prescott, he said, unwrapping his lunch, draining a residential pool isn't a municipal violation, it's standard maintenance. But what about the children? Karen's voice took on the desperate edge she usually reserved for truly lost causes. All that water rushing into storm drains, it's creating hazardous conditions. Someone could slip. Councilman Rodriguez looked up from his sandwich. Has anyone slipped? Well, not yet. But come back when someone does. Karen left City Hall with her dignity bruised, but her determination intact. Fine. If the official channels wouldn't help, she'd document everything herself. Evidence was what they wanted. Evidence was what they'd get. She returned home and retrieved Gerald's old camcorder from the garage, the one they'd used to film their daughter's soccer games before she went to college, and stopped returning their calls. Karen positioned herself strategically behind her azaleas and began filming the environmental disaster unfolding across the street. Day 2 of the Willowbrook water crisis, she narrated into the camera with the solemnity of a war correspondent. The defendant continues his reckless endangerment of community resources, despite multiple warnings from HOA authorities. Gerald found her there an hour later, crouched behind the bushes like a private investigator. Karen, what are you doing now? Building a case, she hissed, not taking her eye from the viewfinder. When someone sues the HOA for allowing this environmental catastrophe, we'll have proof that I tried to stop it. Gerald sat down heavily on their porch steps. Karen, nobody's going to sue the HOA. It's just Mike draining his pool. But Karen was beyond reason now. In her mind, this had become about more than water. It was about respect, authority, and the very fabric of civilized society. If people could just drain pools willy-nilly, what was next? Unauthorized garden domes? Christmas lights after New Year's Day? The horror. That evening, she called an emergency HOA meeting, despite the fact that she was the only remaining board member. She set up folding chairs in her living room, prepared an agenda, and waited. Nobody came. At 7:30 p.m., sitting alone in her living room surrounded by empty chairs, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: doubt. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence, each sound echoing her isolation. But as she looked out her window and saw Mike Henderson calmly checking his pool's progress, the doubt transformed into something harder and more dangerous. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. Karen opened her laptop and began composing emails to every city department she could think of: environmental protection, public works, code enforcement, even animal control. If she couldn't stop Mike Henderson through the HOA, she'd find someone who could. The war was just beginning.